The war ended, but captivity did not. By 1943, German prisoners of war were already crossing the Atlantic, bound for camps in America. They expected hunger, hard labor, and silence. What they found stunned them. The first shock was not in barracks or in fields. It was in the mess halls. Prisoners stepped inside expecting thin soup and stale bread. Instead, they saw tubs of ice cream, steaming trays of meat, baskets of fruit. They smelled coffee, strong and sweet. They saw bottles of Coca-Cola sweating in buckets of ice. One machine, two empires. To the prisoners, America had been a shadow in propaganda, a country of jazz, factories, and materialism. In the camps, they learned that even in war, America was a country of abundance. The German army had rationed bread in grams, meat in ounces, fat in drops. In the camps, the menu included chicken, beef, potatoes, corn, and on Sundays, ice cream. Quiet scenes told how deep the shock ran. In a camp in Texas, a young German soldier held a bottle of Coca-Cola for the first time. He turned it in his hands, reading the curves of glass as if it were an artifact. He whispered, "They make this for soldiers? For children?" At a camp in Wisconsin, prisoners lined up for ice cream. One scooped a spoonful, paused, and laughed bitterly. "We fought for bread. They fight with this." At night, in barracks lit by bulbs, brighter than most German towns had known in years, men whispered about the strangeness of it all. One muttered, "We lost the war the moment we tasted their peace." The paradox was everywhere. Coca-Cola and ice cream were not luxuries in America. They were daily habits. In Germany, even officers had gone years without sweets. Civilians had boiled turnips into ersatz jam. Children had licked beet syrup from fingers. Soldiers had carried black bread hard as stone. And yet in captivity, there were cones of ice cream, fizzing sodas, chocolate bars. An American guard shrugged when asked why. "Because this is what we eat." For the Germans, the answer was more terrifying than a weapon. The numbers painted the contrast. By 1945, more than 370,000 German POWs were held in the United States. Dozens of camps spread from Texas to Wisconsin, from Georgia to Oregon. Each camp followed American rations, not German shortages. The average prisoner consumed more calories per day in captivity than his family in Hamburg or Dresden. Meat, half a pound daily. Bread, fresh, not ersatz. Milk and fruit, regular. Ice cream on Sundays. Coca-Cola whenever supplies allowed. Scenes made the numbers real. A prisoner in Georgia wrote in his diary, "I eat more in one day here than in a week at home. My mother writes of hunger. I feel guilt with every spoonful." In Oklahoma, another whispered to his bunkmate, "When I return, how can I tell them I ate ice cream while they starved?" A third, in Colorado, laughed when handed a bottle of Coke. "We drank mud, now we drink bubbles." The taste carried both joy and shame. The paradox deepened with every meal. For Americans, Coca-Cola was a symbol of normal life. For prisoners, it was a symbol of defeat. They realized that if a country could feed captives with sugar and ice while their own families starved in ruins, the war had already been lost long before surrender. One prisoner put it in plain words, "They do not win with guns. They win with what they can spare." The memory of flavor lingered. Some POWs wrote of their first spoon of ice cream as vividly as of their first battle. One recalled in later years, "It was cold, sweet, unreal. I did not believe it was for us, but it was." Another remembered opening a bottle of Coke and watching the bubbles rise. "I thought it was a trick. Then I tasted it. It was America in my mouth." The shock spread beyond taste. Meals were not only rich, but orderly. Plates were clean, forks polished, milk fresh. In Germany, families had eaten from chipped bowls, often sharing portions. In camps, even prisoners ate from trays designed for plenty. One man wrote, "The food is more than food. It is proof. Proof that they can afford to feed us better than we fed ourselves in freedom." It was not kindness alone. America fed its prisoners well because Geneva demanded it, because farms were fertile, because factories were endless. But for the POWs, reason mattered less than result. They tasted the difference between scarcity and plenty, between defeat and abundance, between Germany and America. For many prisoners, the taste did not end in the camp. It etched itself into memory, sharper than gunfire, deeper than wounds. Long after the war, they recalled first spoons of ice cream or the hiss of a Coke bottle opening. They remembered sweetness as shock. One veteran, interviewed in the 1970s, laughed bitterly, "I forgot battles. I forgot the names of towns. But I never forgot the first Coca-Cola. Another told a journalist, "My clearest memory is not of fighting in Russia, but of ice cream in captivity." It was not indulgence, it was contrast. A man in Hamburg in 1950 bought his son a bottle of Coca-Cola when the drink returned to Germany. He placed it in the boy's hand and said, "Now you will understand why we lost." In Munich, a former POW took his family to an American-style ice cream parlor. He ate slowly, spoon by spoon, eyes closed. His wife asked why he looked sad. He whispered, "Because this reminds me of when we were beaten." For Americans, Coke and ice cream were nostalgia, childhood treats, summer afternoons. For former prisoners, they were reminders of surrender, of captivity, of being shown what another nation could afford. One said, "Every sip is sweet. Every sip tastes like shame." Another countered, "Every sip tastes like survival." The same flavor carried guilt and gratitude. By the 1950s, Coca-Cola had spread across Europe, sold openly in shops, drunk in cafes. Millions of Germans tasted it. But among former POWs, the experience was different. They had tasted it first in captivity, when their families starved. To them, the drink was not just refreshment, it was revelation. Ice cream shops multiplied in cities rebuilt from rubble. Yet for some, the first cone always belonged to a summer behind barbed wire. At a reunion of former prisoners in the 1960s, men toasted with bottles of Coke instead of beer. One raised his bottle and said, "To defeat." Another corrected him, "To survival." They clinked glass and drank in silence. In Bremen, a grandfather handed his grandson a cone of vanilla. The boy licked happily. The old man smiled, but his hands shook. "It was this," he murmured, "that told me we were finished." Children saw treats. Veterans saw symbols. Families did not always understand why fathers frowned over desserts, why grandfathers stared at soda bottles. The sweetness carried a history too bitter to explain. One POW wrote decades later, "Ice cream was my surrender. Coca-Cola was my education. They taught me more than any guard." Historians collecting oral accounts found food mentioned as often as weapons. Veterans described rations, flavors, smells. They spoke less of fear in battle than of hunger before capture, and of shock in captivity. A researcher wrote, "The POW remembers not the bullet that missed him, but the sweetness he did not expect." By the mid-1950s, the war was a decade past, but its flavors were still fresh. Coca-Cola returned to German shops, carried in crates by delivery trucks with bright red logos. Ice cream parlors reopened, this time with neon signs and American music on the radio. For a new generation, these were simply pleasures of peace. For former prisoners, they were reminders. A man in Frankfurt bought his first Coke at a corner shop. He lifted the bottle, tasted, and smiled. His wife asked why he looked so strange. He answered, "Because this is not new. I drank this first behind wire." Teenagers in Berlin laughed on summer evenings, holding cones that dripped down their hands. They talked of music, of love, of motorbikes. At the same tables sat men in their 30s, former POWs, silent over the same cones. To the young, ice cream was joy. To the older, it was memory. In Munich, an American company opened a soda fountain. Crowds lined up, excited to taste something foreign. One man stepped aside, shaking his head. "I know this tastes too well," he muttered. Coca-Cola became a symbol of modern West Germany, a drink linked with optimism, industry, and youth culture. Ice cream became a family ritual, eaten on Sunday walks through rebuilt cities. Yet in private, many former POWs still carried the weight of their first taste. One said, "Every bottle here is victory, but not ours." Another side, "Every cone here is peace, but I found it in captivity." By 1960, Coca-Cola plants operated in multiple German cities. Production reached millions of bottles per year. Ice cream consumption in West Germany doubled within a decade. What had once been unimaginable in wartime, cold, sweet cream, fizzy drinks, became ordinary. Ordinary for the children, extraordinary for their fathers. A father in Stuttgart watched his children sip Cokes. They laughed, clinking bottles like glasses. He forced a smile, then stepped outside. Later, he told a friend, "They celebrate with what once shamed me." At a family picnic in Hamburg, a grandfather refused dessert. His daughter insisted, handing him a cone. He took one bite, nodded, and whispered, "Strange. Still tastes like surrender." In German slang of the 1950s, Cola kind meant a child of the new consumer age. Advertisements linked Coca-Cola with vitality and youth. Yet for some veterans, the word carried a sting. "We were cola men," one laughed bitterly, "but in cages." Ice cream became shorthand for modern prosperity, served in colorful bowls layered with fruit. For many, it symbolized progress. For others, it symbolized the abyss between hunger at home and plenty in captivity. Writers described post-war treats with ambivalence. One novel spoke of a POW who could not enjoy dessert without remembering his family's hunger. A poet wrote, "The fizz in my glass is not joy. It is the echo of boots behind barbed wire." Children grew up thinking Coca-Cola and ice cream had always been there, as natural as bread or milk. Parents carried scars, invisible, but alive. At Sunday tables, sweetness united families but divided memories. One man summed it up simply. For them, Coke is peace. For us, Coke was captivity. Life in the camps was not only about wire and watchtowers. It was about routine. Wake-up calls, work details, meals served on time. Guards were often farmers or students in uniform. And in the middle of it all, flavors the prisoners could not forget. For many, Coca-Cola and ice cream became more than tastes. They became markers of a strange rhythm. Cones on Sundays, bottles at holidays, desserts in the canteen. The weeks of captivity were measured not by battles, but by scoops and fizz. One man said years later, "I counted time not by days. I counted by ice cream." In Texas, men returned from the fields, sweat on their shirts, dirt on their boots. At the mess hall, they found trays waiting, each with a spoonful of ice cream. One stared at the melting white mound and whispered, "Even our officers never had this." In Oklahoma, guards distributed bottles of Coke at Christmas. Prisoners raised them like glasses. One said, "This is the strangest Christmas. We are behind wire, but we drink like Americans." For men who had expected cruelty, abundance felt unsettling. Some wrote home proudly of fair treatment. Others felt guilt. "We are fed like kings while our families scrape frost from windows," one confessed. Each camp followed rations approved by the War Department. Calories, nearly 3,000 daily. Protein every day. Dessert, at least once a week. Coca-Cola delivered by truck. Ice cream from local dairies. In Germany, civilians queued hours for bread. In America, even prisoners drank Coke cold. One diary in Colorado read, "If this is captivity, what is freedom? If this is defeat, what is victory?" Camps organized concerts and sports. After a soccer match in Nebraska, the winning team received a crate of Coca-Cola. The men laughed, then fell silent. "We lose the war, but we win this match," someone muttered. A young guard from Iowa once gave his ration of ice cream to a thin German. The prisoner ate, then said quietly, "You fight me with kindness. It is harder than bullets." Not everyone accepted sweetness. One soldier refused ice cream. "I will not eat what my children cannot." Another smashed his Coke bottle on the floor, shouting, "This is humiliation." Yet days later, even he lined up again. Hunger spoke louder than pride. In Nebraska, a prisoner collected Coca-Cola caps. By war's end, he had a sack of them. "I want proof this existed," he told his bunkmate. In Wisconsin, a man drew a mural of a giant ice cream cone with the word "victory." Guards made him paint it over. Every sweet mouthful reminded them of what their families lacked. Every Coke bottle clink reminded them of what their empire could not build. One sighed, "We are prisoners of plenty. Our bars are made of sugar." German officers tried to restrict indulgence. They scolded men for drinking Coke or singing American songs. Yet guards noted, "By night, the same men are at the canteen." In Texas, a man refused dessert for months. When he finally tried ice cream, he cried, "It tastes like everything we lost," he said. Another sipped Coke and muttered, "This is the taste of the enemy." His comrade smiled. "Then the enemy is sweet." A prisoner in Georgia put it plain, "We did not all lose the war the same way. Some lost with bullets, others lost with sweets." Captivity did not always mean fences. By 1944, thousands of German prisoners worked outside the camps, sent in groups to farms, factories, and timber yards. Under guard, but often trusted, they labored in fields, harvested crops, repaired roads. And in those moments, they saw America more directly. The shock was not only in the barns and orchards. It was in kitchens and shops and simple meals shared after long hours. Coca-Cola and ice cream followed them beyond the wire, not as rations, but as glimpses of American daily life. One POW remembered, "I was given a bottle of Coke by a farmer's wife. She handed it to me as if it were nothing. For us, it was treasure. For her, it was ordinary." In Nebraska, men picked corn for a local farmer. At noon, he brought out sandwiches and a cooler. Inside were bottles of Coca-Cola sweating in the sun. The prisoners stared. The farmer chuckled, "Drink. You worked for it." One soldier sipped, then whispered, "Even prisoners drink better here than civilians at home." In Texas, a group worked in cotton fields. At the end of the day, the farmers' children appeared carrying cones of ice cream. They licked happily while staring at the strangers in dusty uniforms. The prisoner muttered, "Look at them. They eat as if the war never happened." Every sight of Coca-Cola in a civilian's hand, every lick of ice cream by a child, drove home the same truth. In America, abundance was normal. The Germans, raised on scarcity, it was unbearable. One man said, "We thought America strong because of tanks. We were wrong. It is strong because its children can eat ice cream in war." By 1944, America produced over 20 million gallons of ice cream each week. Coca-Cola bottling plants operated in more than 60 locations nationwide, ensuring supply not just for soldiers, but for civilians and even prisoners. Germany by then rationed sugar to a few ounces per person per month. Ice cream was non-existent. Coca-Cola, banned as enemy decadence, was remembered only in rumors. In Oklahoma, a POW was invited into a farmhouse kitchen to mend a tool. The farmer's wife handed him a glass of cold milk with ice cubes floating. She added a spoonful of chocolate syrup. He stared. At home, we drink water. Here, even milk is sweet. In Wisconsin, men worked in dairies, hauling cream. At the end of the day, they were allowed to taste. One wrote, "We carried buckets of butterfat. Our families had none. We licked our fingers and felt shame." On supervised trips through American streets, they saw shops filled with food, bakeries with cakes in windows, soda fountains with red stools and chrome taps, children with cones, soldiers with Coke bottles, couples laughing over sundaes. One POW later said, "The war ended for me not with surrender, but with a window full of chocolate cakes." Another recalled, "I saw neon signs for Coca-Cola in a small town. We fought for barrels of coal. They lit streets with sugar water." In Georgia, a boy on a bicycle stopped to stare at German workers. He held a bottle of Coca-Cola in one hand, his thumb covering the label. He raised it in mock salute, then rode off. The prisoners watched him vanish into the heat. One muttered, "That child has more victory in his hand than we had in our army." In Texas, a farmer's daughter offered a prisoner a spoonful of her ice cream, giggling at his accent when he thanked her. He took one bite, then froze, staring at the cone. Later he wrote, "Her laughter was lighter than any weapon. She defeated me more than any bullet." Back in barracks, men spoke less of battles and more of what they had seen. Shop windows, Sundays, red and white Coke signs. The abundance outside the wire haunted them more than fences or guards. One whispered, "We will return home with stories no one will believe. They will think we lie." Another answered, "No, they will know we lost when they taste what we tasted." The images of abundance did not fade when the prisoners returned to camp. They carried them in silence, then into letters. Even when censorship cut sharp, glimpses slipped through, flavors, colors, textures. A man in Oklahoma wrote home, "Today I saw more food in one store window than we had in our whole street in a year." The censors let it pass. His wife, reading in bombed Dresden, felt both comfort and despair. Another prisoner in Nebraska wrote, "I was given a bottle of Coca-Cola after work. It tasted like victory, but not ours." His mother in Hamburg folded the paper and hid it. She could not bear to read it twice. In Texas, a man scribbled about a child with ice cream dripping down his hand. He licked it and laughed. At that moment, I knew we were finished. His wife received the letter months later and showed it to neighbors. Some wept, others raged. They feed even their children, while ours dig for roots. In Wisconsin, a prisoner described milk and chocolate syrup. "They put sugar in milk," he wrote. "Do not tell the children, it would hurt them." Letters that were meant to comfort families often cut deeper. How could a man explain that captivity gave him more sweetness than freedom gave his children? One POW wrote, "I eat ice cream, you eat weeds. Forgive me." Another, "Every bite I take here is stolen from your hunger." Some stopped writing about food altogether. They wrote only of work, weather, fences. But memory pressed between the lines. In Georgia, a man confessed to his bunkmate, "I dream of bringing them all a bottle, just one, even if it costs me my soul." In Colorado, another held up a Coca-Cola cap and said, "This is smaller than a coin, but it buys defeat." Many who returned carried the taste as secret burden. One veteran admitted in the 1960s, "When I kissed my wife, she asked what captivity was like. I told her it was bitter. I did not tell her it was sweet." Another laughed sadly in 1980, "I forgot hunger, I forgot pain. But I never forgot the fizz of that first Coca-Cola." Historians who interviewed former POWs noticed the same pattern. Descriptions of Coca-Cola and ice cream more vivid than descriptions of battles. One said, "I do not remember the faces of my guards. I remember the fizz in my mouth." Another said, "I do not remember the sound of surrender. I remember the clink of bottles." After the war, when prisoners returned to Germany, the memories of Coca-Cola and ice cream did not stay behind the fences. They crossed the ocean with them, shaping how they saw America in the years that followed. In West Germany, the arrival of Coca-Cola in shops during the late 1940s was greeted with curiosity, sometimes even celebration. For the younger generation, it was novelty. For former POWs, it was déjà vu. They had tasted it already, in captivity, under the shadow of defeat. One man said, "When I saw Coca-Cola on sale in Frankfurt, I felt I was back in camp. Sweet, cold, and humiliating." Another said, "I bought a bottle only to prove to myself that it was real, and I drank it with guilt." In Hamburg, children clutched cones of ice cream on rebuilt streets, their parents smiling. Yet among the crowd stood fathers who had eaten the same dessert in captivity. One whispered to his friend, "They will never know that their treat was our surrender." In Munich, a new soda fountain opened in 1951. Young people filled the stools, laughing as they sipped Coke floats. At a corner table sat a veteran, silent, staring into his glass. "This is no drink," he muttered. "This is memory." In East Germany, Coca-Cola was rare, sometimes smuggled, sometimes officially banned as a symbol of capitalism. Ice cream was available, but modest, rationed, unadorned. Former POWs there spoke less openly, but the memory lingered. One recalled, "They told us America was weak. Yet in captivity, we drank what our children here never tasted." Another whispered, "In the West, they eat it freely. For us, it is only a story." By the mid-1950s, West Germany was one of Coca-Cola's fastest-growing markets, with millions of bottles sold each month. Ice cream parlors doubled in number during the decade. In East Germany, production remained limited. Consumption per person, a fraction of the West. The taste became geography, sweetness on one side, scarcity on the other. In Bonn, a politician toasted with Coca-Cola at a party conference, calling it a symbol of recovery. In Leipzig, a man who had been a POW whispered to his comrades, "That toast tastes like chains." In Berlin, divided and tense, the same drink carried two meanings. In the West, it was modernity. In the East, it was a forbidden memory. Some veterans in West Germany embraced the taste, buying Coca-Cola for their children, eating ice cream on Sundays. Others avoided it, refusing to let their families see them touch it. One father explained, "I never drank Coke again. It belonged to my defeat." Another admitted, "I drank it often, not because I liked it, but because I wanted to own it this time." Decades later, memories remained sharp. One said, "I do not remember the faces of my guards. I remember the fizz in my mouth." Others said, "We lost the war with guns. We remembered it was sugar." And the war ended and ships carried prisoners back across the Atlantic. Many Germans stepped onto European soil and streets memories. Sharpest was the taste of Coca-Cola and ice cream, lingering longer than the sound of engines without disembarkation of friends, pop, rubble, ration cars, and silence. Families waited thin, children gone, homes bombed or gone. Men who had eaten 3,000 calories a day in captivity now returned to streets where bread was scarce, sugar absent, and milk water. One man said years later, "I came home fatter than when I left." My wife looked at me with hunger in her eyes. In Hamburg, a former prisoner greeted his son with open arms. The boy clung to him, thin and pale. The father reached into his pocket and pulled out a Coca-Cola cap he had saved. He placed it in the child's hand, whispering, "This was my treasure." The boy turned it over, confused. In Dresden, a man brought home a drawing he had made in camp. A bottle of Coca-Cola, carefully shaded, bubbles rising. His wife studied it in silence. Finally, she asked, "And while we starved, you drew sugar water?" He could not answer. Men who had survived captivity healthier than civilians now felt ashamed. They had eaten ice cream while their families dug roots. They had drunk Coca-Cola while their wives boiled weeds. One confessed in an interview, "We carried guilt in our stomachs, sweet guilt." In 1946, average German daily rations in many cities fell below 1,200 calories. Bread was dark and scarce, meat rare, sugar nearly absent. By comparison, prisoners returning from America had eaten more than twice that amount, with sweets included. A man in Bremen returned home to find his wife skeletal, his children weak. He kissed them, then said, "I cannot tell you what I ate. It would break us." Another in Berlin tried to describe Coca-Cola to his family. "It was cold, sweet, full of bubbles," he said. His daughter stared wide-eyed, then burst into tears. Former POWs often avoided telling their families about food in captivity. They spoke of fences, guards, work, boredom. They left out the ice cream and the soda. One admitted, "I told them I was hungry. It was not true. I lied to protect them." Another, "I told them I was treated harshly, but the hardest thing was to eat more than they did." Germany in 1946 was rubble and hunger. Cities bombed flat, railways twisted, families living in cellars. Into this ruin returned men who had eaten well in captivity. They carried no crates of supplies, but they carried memories that set them apart from their neighbors. In Cologne, a man walked into his mother's apartment carrying nothing. She studied him and asked, "Why do you look healthy when we starved?" He lowered his head and said nothing. In Frankfurt, a former POW offered his brother a story of ice cream in America. The brother snapped, "Keep that story. It is poison here." On the streets, black markets thrived. Cigarettes, chocolate, and coffee were traded like gold. American rations fed not only occupying troops, but also civilians through official aid. Yet for POWs who had tasted these things as captives, their presence in ruined cities felt surreal. "We ate like Americans in cages. Now we eat like beggars in freedom," one muttered. By 1947, rations in many German zones sank to as low as 1,000 calories per day. American soldiers, meanwhile, received more than 4,000. Black markets grew. A bar of chocolate could buy hours of labor, a pack of cigarettes, a night of shelter. In Munich, a man saw an American soldier hand a German child a chocolate bar. The boy grinned. The former POW turned away, whispering, "He eats what I once ate, but not as a prisoner, as a beggar." Some wives resented their husbands for returning healthier than their children. Others demanded stories of America's food as if it were fantasy. A man remembered his wife asking, "Is it true you ate ice cream in prison?" He nodded. She turned away in silence. For many, captivity was remembered less for wire and guards than for abundance and guilt. They carried it like a shadow through the ruins of Germany. "Every scoop of ice cream there made a hole here. Every bubble of Coke was a bomb of shame," one said. By the late 1940s, as West Germany entered recovery and East Germany hardened under rationing, memory of captivity's sweetness shaped politics as well as families. Coca-Cola and ice cream became cultural lines, dividing past from future, east from west. In the West, U.S. soldiers distributed candy and chocolate to children. The candy bombers of the Berlin airlift dropped sweets tied to parachutes. Former POWs watched children chase sugar through the sky. Some smiled, some wept. "It was the same taste that shamed me. Now it saves my city," one said. In West Berlin, children licked ice cream at new parlors. Veterans stared from benches, remembering cones in captivity. One whispered, "They will never know that we first ate this behind wire." In East Berlin, Coca-Cola was nearly absent, its signs painted over. Yet veterans there still remembered its fizz. One muttered, "I tasted it once, in chains. I will taste it never again." By 1949, West Germany consumed millions of bottles of Coca-Cola annually. Ice cream production surged with prosperity. In East Germany, per capita sugar consumption remained low. Shops plain, flavors limited. In Bonn, a politician toasted with Coca-Cola at a festival, calling it proof of renewal. A veteran shook his head. "It is not renewal. It is reminder." In Dresden, a man told his children stories of ice cream in captivity. His daughter asked softly, "Was that America?" He nodded. "That was defeat. Some veterans embraced the taste. Others refused it." One father explained, "I never drank Coke again. It belonged to my defeat." Another admitted, "I drank it often, not because I liked it, but because I wanted to own it this time." At reunions, former prisoners spoke of fences, guards, boredom. But the stories that drew silence were always about food. One lifted a glass of soda in his 80s and whispered, "This is the taste of my defeat and my life." Another, spooning ice cream in a nursing home, smiled through tears. "This is the taste that told me I would live." By the 1950s, the war was fading into memory, but the taste of captivity remained vivid. Former POWs lived among neighbors who had never left Germany, among families who had endured hunger without relief. And while cities rebuilt and shops filled again, Many veterans still carried the weight of their first Coca-Cola or cone of ice cream. For some, those flavors became symbols of humiliation. For others, they became a strange comfort, a reminder of survival. Either way, they were unforgettable. At a Sunday walk in Hamburg, children licked cones of ice cream bought from new parlors with the neon lights. Fathers watched in silence. One whispered to another veteran beside him, "We ate this first as captives. Our children eat it as citizens." In Frankfurt, a man opened a bottle of Coca-Cola at a family picnic. His wife laughed and clinked her glass. He drank, then set the bottle down hard. "For you, it is joy," he muttered. "For me, it is chains." West German newspapers often showed advertisements for Coca-Cola, bright and cheerful. Ice cream shops sponsored children's events. For the younger generation, these were symbols of modernity, progress, even freedom. But in veteran circles, the same images provoked unease. Some refused to drink Coca-Cola at gatherings. Others mocked themselves as cola men. One said simply, "They sell it as victory. We remember it as defeat." By 1955, Coca-Cola plants in West Germany produced millions of bottles monthly. Ice cream consumption per capita had doubled since 1945. For the young, this was prosperity. For the old, it was memory. In Bonn, children cheered as clowns tossed cones of ice cream to them at a fair. A veteran turned away, muttering, "Once we fought for bread. Now they throw sugar to crowds." The sweetness of captivity became a generational divide. Children of the 1950s and 60s grew up with Coca-Cola in their hands and ice cream on their tongues, seeing them as normal parts of life. For them, sugar was freedom. For their fathers, it was memory. At a family picnic in Düsseldorf, children begged for Coca-Cola. Their grandfather, a former POW, sat apart sipping water. His son asked why. He answered quietly, "Because every bubble tastes like wire." In Berlin, teenagers bought ice cream after school. A veteran watched from a bench, muttering to himself, "They lick victory. I lick defeat." At family tables, some fathers poured Coca-Cola for their children, smiling as they drank. Others refused, banning it from their homes. One said, "I first drank it when I had lost everything. I will never drink it again." By the 1960s, West Germany had become one of Coca-Cola's strongest markets in Europe, with tens of millions of bottles consumed each year. Ice cream parlors spread in every city, Sundays marked by cones and sundaes. For children, it was prosperity. For fathers, paradox. In Hamburg, a boy offered his grandfather a lick of his ice cream cone. The old man shook his head and whispered, "I have eaten enough to last a lifetime." In Stuttgart, a waiter set a Coke in front of a veteran. He pushed it away. His daughter asked why. He said, "Because I first drank it when I had lost everything." Many veterans chose not to explain. They smiled, they nodded, they let their children drink and eat. But inside, every sip, every scoop echoed with chains. One veteran summed it up. "To them, it was joy. To us, it was judgment." By the 1960s, Coca-Cola and ice cream appeared in songs, films, advertisements. For the young, they were symbols of freedom, of America, of a new world. For veterans, they remained symbols of loss. In West German cinemas, comedies showed young couples sipping Coca-Cola. Audiences laughed, but older men sat stiff. One said after leaving, "They call it romance. I call it surrender." In magazines, advertisements showed smiling families with ice cream sundaes. A former POW muttered, "We once ate that in chains. Now they sell it as happiness." By 1965, Coca-Cola was bottled in more than a dozen West German cities. Ice cream consumption had tripled since the war. America's symbols had become Germany's staples. At a reunion of former prisoners in Hanover, men sat at a table. The waiter offered Coca-Cola, half accepted, half refused. One lifted his glass and said, "To survival." Another pushed it away and muttered, "To shame." In Dresden, veterans remembered but could not repeat. One whispered, "We tasted the future in captivity. Now we taste the past." For some, Coca-Cola and ice cream were harmless prosperity. For others, they were reminders of defeat. But for all, they were unforgettable. One veteran, holding a cone in his 80s, smiled through tears. "This is the taste of my youth, my defeat, and my survival." By the 1970s, the men who had once been prisoners were middle-aged, many with children grown and grandchildren on the way. The war was history for their families, but for them it was still memory, etched not only in gunfire or rubble, but in sweetness. Journalists and historians asked what captivity had been like. The answer surprised the young. One man said, "I do not remember battles. I remember Coca-Cola." Another, The taste of ice cream is sharper in my mind than the sound of surrender. At a birthday party in Munich, grandchildren licked ice cream. Their grandfather whispered, "I first tasted this in chains." In Bremen, a veteran raised a Coke bottle at a barbecue, then set it down. It still tastes like defeat. For some, the memory softened. For others, it grew heavier. One said, "Sweetness is the scar I cannot heal." By the 1970s, Germany consumed hundreds of millions of bottles of Coca-Cola yearly. Ice cream was ordinary for families. But for veterans, it was never ordinary. In Stuttgart, a grandfather told his grandson at a cafe, "You eat this because we lost." Memoirs appeared. One wrote, "I wrote little about battles. I wrote much about Coca-Cola." Another ended, "I survived the war with sugar." At a reunion in Hanover, men argued again. One lifted his glass. "To survival." Another muttered, "To shame." In Hamburg, a veteran told school children, "Captivity tasted of ice cream." They laughed. He did not. Surveys showed younger Germans linked Coca-Cola with freedom, older veterans with defeat. One taste, two meanings. In Munich, a grandson offered a Coke. The old man pushed it away. "You drink freedom, I drink chains." In Berlin, another whispered over a cone, "This is the taste that told me I would live, and the taste that told me I had lost." By the 1980s, veterans were old. Their voices trembled, their memories sharp. One said, "I forgot fear. I never forgot sweetness." In Bonn, a man spooned ice cream slowly in a nursing home. "This is the taste of my youth, my defeat, my survival." In Dresden, another lifted a Coke bottle at his birthday, then set it down. "It belongs to my chains." By 1985, Coca-Cola was everywhere in Germany. Ice cream lined every street, ordinary for most, extraordinary still for survivors. At a reunion, one man toasted with Coke. To life, another refused. To loss, silence followed. One said in his last interview, "The war gave me wounds. America gave me sugar. Both never left me." By the 1990s, many former prisoners were gone. Those who remained were old men, their memories fragile, but their stories vivid. Historians and filmmakers recorded final testimonies. Again and again, sweetness appeared. One veteran said, "I cannot remember the name of my camp commander, but I remember the fizz on my tongue." Another, "They ask about guards. I tell them about ice cream." In Cologne, a grandfather told his grandson about his first Coca-Cola. It was cold. It was sweet. It was defeat. In Dresden, a veteran watched a Coke advertisement on TV and muttered, "They still sell my chains." Museums displayed Coca-Cola bottles and ration slips side by side. School groups whispered in disbelief. By 2000, fewer than a quarter of POWs were alive, but thousands of interviews survived. In more than half, Coca-Cola and ice cream appeared. In Munich, a teacher asked what captivity meant. A boy answered, "They drank Coca-Cola." Veterans had told the story so often it became shorthand. By the 2000s, memory shifted to families. In Berlin, a granddaughter wrote, "My grandfather survived on ice cream and Coca-Cola. It was the strangest defeat." In Stuttgart, a son recalled, "He never drank Coca-Cola again. He said it belonged to his chains." Families kept bottle caps and letters as heirlooms. A grandson said, "He left me nothing but a cap. He told me it was worth more than gold." By 2010, more than 5,000 oral histories were archived. In Bonn, a granddaughter raised her spoon of ice cream. For Opa. In Munich, a grandson placed a Coke cap in a glass case. "This is his medal." Teachers used the stories to explain America's power. One student said, "It was sugar that won." By the 2010s, veterans were almost all gone. Their voices lived only in archives. In Berlin, a museum titled "Sweet Captivity" showed bottles and letters. A teenager whispered, "I thought war was guns. I did not know it was ice cream." In Frankfurt, a documentary aired old men saying, "I forgot battles. I remembered Coca-Cola." Viewers were shocked. By 2020, fewer than 1,000 former POWs were alive. Their last words still spoke of sweetness. One said, "I die with sugar on my tongue." In Dresden, a granddaughter told her son, "Your great-grandfather ate ice cream in prison." The boy laughed. It was not a joke. In Cologne, a family placed a Coke cap beside medals. The label read, "The Taste of Captivity." Coca-Cola and ice cream had become heritage. They were no longer food, but testimony. One historian said, "The war was steel and fire. The memory was sugar." Another veteran whispered on his deathbed, "I tasted defeat. It was sweet